And the next file is my meteorological data file. So what's the first thing we're going to do? We're going to copy it and rename it. So let's copy it and paste it into my Toolbox import files folder. And let's rename it. Before I go forward with that, what you might want to do, because now you have two PM 2.5 data files in this folder, you might want to go ahead and delete the one that is not going to be imported into Toolbox. So remember, this one's not going to be imported into Toolbox because it was a space delimited file. So you might just want to delete that. And that's okay because you're just doing it import files. You're in your Toolbox import files folder. So you know that that's not an original data file. So I'm going to go ahead and delete that just so I'm not confused over what one to import into the Toolbox. I'm going to delete that out. Okay, so now let's go on with our meteorological data file and let's see what manipulations we need to perform on that particular file. So let's open it up. So let's take a look here. We can see that the columns are separated by commas, so we know it's a comma delimited file. So chances are we can import that as a text file and we don't have to import it into the spreadsheet first. So let's take a look at the checklist for a text file. So let's go through here. Okay, so it's a comma delimited file, so I checked that off. It has an extension of .txt. That is true. Unique column names for each column. In row 1, let's take a look. It's got column names. And it has, let's see how many columns we have here. We have 1, which is my date and time. Then we've got a wind speed, that's 2. We've got precipitation, that's 3. Temperature, that's 4. Battery voltage, and that's 5. So we got a total of 5 columns. So we should have 5 columns here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I must have skipped one. Oh, I skipped percent relative humidity. So we got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 column names. So we're good. So data begins in row 2. That's correct. Here's where the data starts. So we check that off. No blank rows. So let's scroll through this record. This file. So at the very bottom, we see there's a bunch of space. And what that usually means is there's blank rows. And that's not something you want to import into the Toolbox. So we need to remove those blank rows before we import it. So we're not going to check that off. And the checklist contains complete dates in common date format or serial date format and times in a new row. So we have a date and a time. And notice that they're in the same column because there's no comma that separates them. That's okay. The Toolbox can recognize that, and that's okay. So we don't have to worry about making any manipulations there. So we can go ahead and check that off. We've got times in each time in a new row. Okay, concentration of parameter data has at least 1 digit after the decimal in the first row of data. So as we're looking at that, we see that wind speed has that, precipitation doesn't. And this is very common with precipitation data because it might be that you have a day later in your file that there was actually rain. The first couple of days there was no rain, and so it comes off as 0. What happens with the Toolbox and text files is if it sees those bunches of zeros, so it sees like 2 days worth of zeros, it says, oh, I see that this is integer data. I'm just going to import this as an integer. It doesn't realize that there's decimals coming later on in the file. So that's a problem. And that only applies to text files. But if that's the case, you need to add a decimal point and a 0 after it. And then the Toolbox knows that there's decimals to come later on. So that's something we need to do. Precipitation, percent relative humidity is fine. Temperature is fine, and battery voltage is fine. We don't have to worry about it anywhere else but in precipitation. So I don't check that off. I don't know the number of records yet, so I'm not going to check that off. Have a backup copy made and saved elsewhere. I do. I'm just going to double check because I always double check everything so I don't make mistakes. Here's my original data file, and here's my manipulated data file. So I've got my original saved and not changed at all. So I can check that off. And now we're going to make the modifications. So let's see what the first unchecked item is. No blank rows. So we need to go and we need to get rid of these blank rows. So the way to do that in a text file is go ahead and click on the first blank row and then click and drag. So when you click and drag on regular data, so notice it's highlighted so you can tell that it's selected. And when you click and drag on empty rows in a text file, it doesn't look like they're selected, but they are selected. So once you've done that click and drag, press delete on your keyboard and you'll see what happens. So when I press delete, watch what happens. So it jumps up, so those blank rows at the end of the file were removed. So I can go ahead and check that off in my little checklist. No blank rows, yay! Precipitation data. So let's take a look at that. So I need to, at the top of the file, for my first precipitation value, I need to enter as 0.0. Because like I said, if I didn't do that, and I had a value, let's say I had a value of, I had a huge rainy hour, and I had 1.54 inches in 1 hour. The toolbox will look at that and say, okay, so everything else in that was 0 with the integer, so I'm going to just go ahead and import that as a 1. So it's going to leave out that 0.54 unless you make this adjustment. So what I need to do is I need to click right after the 0. I need to enter a decimal point and then a 0. And that ensures that the toolbox recognizes precipitation decimal instead of integer. So I did that. So I can go ahead and check that off. And now I need to determine the number of records in my file. Remember, that's done in a text file by using this status bar thing. So if I scroll to the very bottom and I click on that last row, and I have a line number of 337, so that's the total number of rows in my text file. Remember that one of them is actually my column names, so the total number of actual data rows or records text file is 336. So now what I do is I get out my very useful database logbook and I write down all of these things. So I write down the name of my file. I write down there's 336 records. I write down the time, which is the start date and time, which is August 8th, 2013 at 8 a.m. And the end date and time is August 22nd at 7 a.m. And for my imaginary sample manual, I know these are start times, so I write down that these are start times. I also want to make a note that my times and my dates are in the same column, and they have a column name of time, which can be kind of confusing. So I want to make sure that I know that my dates are actually in that time column. So I write that down as well. And I write down my units for my meteorological parameters. So I write down inches for precipitation, relative humidity in percent, temperature in degrees Fahrenheit, and battery voltage in volts. So I write all that stuff down in my database logbook, and then I save my file. And now that file is ready to import into the toolbox. I make that last check on my checklist. Let's make sure I do that so I don't confuse myself later on. So I want to complete my checklist, and that file is ready to go.